This morning it is my honor to welcome to the Crystal Cathedral Steve Arterburn, host of New Life Live, a nationally syndicated faith-based talk show carried on 180 radio stations nationwide. He's been a frequent guest on Good Morning America, CNN Live, ABC's World News Tonight, and Oprah. Wow, that's good. Steve is a leading authority on human relationships, and he has also authored over 100 best-selling books, including Walking into Walls, the subject, which is the subject for this morning. Would you welcome to the Crystal Cathedral, Steve Arterburn? Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much. It is a great joy to be here. This is not my first time. I spoke here back in 1994, and I thought you'd never ask me back. Really, I thought you'd never ask me back. So it's a great joy to get to be here today. Bobby mentioned the book Walking into Walls. It's a book that I released last year, and it is a book about blind spots that prevent us from finding the life that God has called us to live and living that life. These walls that prevent us from being all that God wants us to be and connecting with other people. I was reading a short little clip from Greenville, Mississippi, where some convicts there were arrested. They weren't arrested breaking out of prison. They were arrested breaking into prison. They had received some rather lengthy sentences, and they thought that if they could tunnel under the fence, go out and get some marijuana and some alcohol and tunnel back in, that it would make their stay there behind those walls in that prison a little more comfortable. Well, you can see the analogy. What we do, we don't knock down our walls that imprison us. We don't break out of these prisons. We do exactly what those convicts do. We get certain things to try to make it more comfortable inside these little prisons that we construct for ourselves. And yet, in Galatians 5:13, it says that God has called us to freedom. So this morning I want to present to you three walls that really prevent us from being all that God wants us to be, and three principles that we can use to knock down those walls. Now, the first wall is a really tough one. It's the wall of stubborn resistance. Stubborn resistance. Now, you know, someone who is stubbornly resistant might say something that's not very attractive in a marriage, and please don't elbow anyone next to you. This is the way I was when you married me, and this is the way I'm going to be. Now, they've done a survey, and they found that for sexual intimacy to grow in a marriage, that's probably the worst thing you could possibly say. This is who I was when you married me, and this is the way I'm going to be. A person who's stubbornly resistant is reactive, is afraid to try something new. In fact, the whole problem is born out of fear, and it's difficult for them to trust that there's a better way. So they dig in their heels. At New Life, we do a weight loss weekend. And during this weight loss weekend, people fly in from all over, some in wheelchairs, they're so overweight. And I stand before them the first night and I say to them, you know, many of you have paid a lot of money and gone to a lot of trouble and expense. Some have paid for 2 seats on an airline. The problem is that bad. But rather than come here to get better, you've come here in a stubbornly resistant way to prove that you cannot get better, to prove that no one knows more than you do. You've come to prove that you're stuck. And it's only when we move out of this stubbornness and this resistance that God can come in and produce some change. It's a lack of courage that keeps us stuck behind this tough wall of stubborn resistance. The second wall is, well, it's tough too, arrogant entitlement. A person who is arrogantly entitled, well, for them, more than enough is never enough. You can never meet up to their expectations, and when you get close, they just set the bar a little bit higher. They compare you to everybody else out there. Why can't you be more like Bob? Look at the vacations that Bob and his wife get to go on. And he spells his name forward and backward the same way. Why can't you have more Bob things in your life? It's pretty tough when someone who is arrogantly entitled is married to someone that's stubbornly resistant. The connection is just not going to be there. And they both become trapped behind these walls rather than to be able to experience humility on the part of the entitled person so that they could connect and be a part of a couple. It's one of the biggest challenges that we have in marriage today. The third wall, well, maybe this is the biggest wall of all. It's the wall of justifiable resentment. Justifiable resentment. Now, I'm not talking about those petty little resentments that we all have, that we all need to get over. I'm talking about those resentments that when you share with somebody else, they say, oh, no wonder you feel that way. No wonder you're so angry and you're so bitter. And they almost encourage us to continue in our anger and our bitterness and our unforgiveness. Probably the most dangerous thing that you could carry around in your life would be this justifiable resentment. Proverbs 27:3 says that a stone is heavy and sand is weighty, but the resentment caused by a fool is even more dangerous. We either live a life where we are extending grace and forgiveness to other people, or we're living a life where we just feel so justified in the hurt and the anger that we feel, and it eats us alive like a cancer in our soul. You can imagine what it's like when a couple, one who is arrogantly entitled and the other one who is stubbornly resistant, when they hold on to all of their resentment against each other, it's no wonder that they end up in a place where even though they live together, they're not even very good friends. It takes an amazing amount of grace that we have been given, that we are willing to bestow on other people for us to move beyond this justifiable resentment. Our ministry, New Life, has a radio show, as Bobby said, New Life Live. And just the other day, we had a man that called in. He was calling about his situation with his wife, and as he explained what had been going on in his marriage, he told the story of his wife and the 3 affairs that she had had, and he was still there with her. Now, that's pretty unusual right there. Most of the time, if a woman is unfaithful, a man will leave. Whereas if a man is unfaithful, many more times, the woman will stay and try to work through whatever it is that led to the problem. But this man explained that in the second affair, his wife had gotten pregnant and there was a baby. If anybody was ever entitled to their resentment, it would be this man. And he could have had the attitude that this is not my child, this is someone else's child, this is just a bad reminder of what's happened in my horrible marriage, and could have rejected that child. And yet that little girl that was born, he took her as his own and adopted her and loved her and made sure that she wasn't just another continuation of a fatherless generation. That's the opposite of justifiable resentment. A few weeks ago, I proceeded over the funeral of my father-in-law, who had been the recipient of much, much abuse in his life from an alcoholic father. And if anybody was justified in their resentment, and if anybody would have been justified to have this bitter, angry life for the rest of their lives, it would have been my father-in-law. But this funeral was full of wonderful stories. I had done funerals where it was pretty tough to get anything good to say about the person. I remember one time I did a funeral of a man who had 9 wives, and all 9 were at the funeral, and I think they were there just to make sure he was actually gone. I think they wanted to be sure the man was dead. But that was not the case for my father-in-law, and my wife shared during this funeral his attitude of grace and forgiveness. That when she was growing up, they didn't even have running water, they had no car, they had a bicycle. And they would take this bicycle and they would go and collect jugs of water and bring it back to the house. And one day the bicycle was stolen. And this father was so full of grace and love and forgiveness, he went out and he got a piece of board and he got some paint and he painted a big sign and put it right outside the front of the house. Whoever stole my bicycle, I forgive you. 3 days later, the bicycle was back. It's just an example of when we are able to work through and move beyond the justifiable resentment that is in our lives. Great things can start to happen rather than if we stay behind that wall, one of these 3 walls. Well, if you're stuck, of course, the number one treatment of choice as human beings is, God, take this away from me. Remove it. We all do that with certain things in our lives. And then when God doesn't take it away, many times we blame God for the problem. Well, I ask Him to change it. I ask Him to do things. But as it says in Galatians 5:13, we are called to freedom. We are called to be free to serve and to love each other. And there are 3 things that we need to do, 3 principles that can move us beyond these walls. The first one is we have to be aware that we have a problem. We have to allow people to tell us the truth about them, about ourselves. Have you ever been at a dinner party or just having lunch with someone and they seemed so fascinated with everything you said and they were so glued on all that was coming out of your mouth, and then you go home and you find out that there was spinach stuck between your teeth? We need people that will tell us the truth about ourselves. We need to be aware of the problem that we have, the wall that is destroying our life. Secondly, we need to not just be aware, but we need to desire for things to be better. We need to ask God to give us that desire if we don't have it. To not be satisfied with this mundane life where we're just stuck in this rut, and rather than crawl out of the rut, we're redecorating the rut. I talked to a man who had an addiction problem, and he said, "Oh, I want it to change, and every day I surrender it up to God to change this addiction, and every day it just comes right back." Well, he was aware, and he had the desire, but he was missing the third element, that third principle. And it is a principle that absolutely changes people's lives, and that is the principle of willingness. We simply must be willing. 2 willing partners in a very sick relationship can fix that relationship. If we are willing to do whatever it takes, willing to get into a car and go to a support group, an AA meeting, to see a counselor, willing maybe just to pick up the phone, willing just to listen to what another person has to say, all sorts of things can open up into our lives. Walls can come down, and we can live in the freedom that God has called us to live in. That's the life that God wants us to live. A couple of weeks ago, I was out in our boat with about 12 kids, pulling them behind the boat. My dad had done this when I was young, and a few years ago I became him, and there I was pulling these kids behind this boat, having a great time, when all of a sudden everything quit. The engine stopped, and I couldn't get it restarted. Well, my wife called the marina, and they sent the boat out with a gas can, and they put gas inside the boat, but as I tried to start it again, nothing happened. So here, with all these kids who had come out here to have this great time, we had to be towed back to the marina by the rescue boat. I was the captain of my ship, and it was not a very proud moment for this captain. And I'm sure the kids were seeing all the other boats out there that they wish they were on, and all the fun that all the other kids were having. We finally made it to the marina, and they called the mechanic, and they brought the mechanic over. He took one look at the boat. He didn't open up the engine well or anything like that. He walks over to where the gears are shifting, and there's a little red switch there called a kill switch. And he just reached over and flipped on that kill switch and asked me to try to start the boat. And of course I tried, and it started right up. Somehow we had flipped the kill switch on the boat. And it doesn't matter how much power you have, how great that engine is, it doesn't matter how much gas is in the tank. If the kill switch isn't flipped on, everything is dead. The kill switch in our lives is willingness. It doesn't matter how much desire or awareness, how much intellect we have. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. If the kill switch is turned off, if we are full of unwillingness to make a change. So today, in this great place with you great people, I think God called me to come and just challenge you to take a look at the walls of stubborn resistance and arrogant entitlement and justifiable resentment. To ask you to be aware of those things and to want something different. And be sure that that switch of willingness is flipped on. God bless you, and thank you for letting me share with you this morning.